Is your path being subliminally made for you already? Are your thoughts, feelings, and behavior identifiable by someone walking by the street? Is the education system not for you or made by someone you're not familiar with? Are the middle class more or less likely to donate based on their wealth? And what's inspiring that? Welcome back to the Aboutcast. Today in the deep rabbit hole, we'll be going over the wild world of the socioeconomic classes. I'm your host, Julian Gray, with my co-host, Jordan. How are you?
I'm doing great, man. I'm excited to talk about this specific topic and about this podcast because reading this academic paper, I found it to be quite interesting to see how much of, it's almost like we're sponges, and not only do we soak up things, but we show what we've soaked up. And so I think that this stuff was just like wow, what an eye opener in a sense. So I'm really hyped about it. How about yourself? How are you doing?
I'm doing grand. This white paper was truly phenomenal in a lot of ways. I thought I understood what was going on between socioeconomic classes, but from what really looked like a 10,000 foot view, and this is a 25-page in-depth, highly cited paper from the British Journal of Social Psychology titled The Psychology of Social Class: How Socioeconomic Status Impacts Thoughts, Feelings, and Behaviors.
I think and let's just jump right into it. The things that this paper kind of talks about is the actual, and I think the same thing that Julian alluded to with saying the title is exactly how your status, as far as your socioeconomic status, affects your thoughts, your feelings, and behavior. And I think that obviously then shapes your world as well. You know, your thoughts and your feelings and your behavior is exactly kind of the base inputs for almost any decision that you make and anything that you react to in your life. So this is how I mean, granted, maybe I'm feeding more into this than really needs to be, but I think that this is something that's super foundational for almost to piece together and make sense of someone's life as something that you can actually extrapolate upon. Like, it has so much weight to it. And maybe, people are going to say like, well, obviously, like, your socioeconomic status is going to affect where you end up in life. But I think that it's more of who you are is what this thing is alluding to. Julian, what do you think about what I just said?
Agreed. Men lie, women lie, numbers don't. And one of the things that stood out to me was they go into this portion about education. And from my point of view and the background and socioeconomic class that I was raised in to the socioeconomic class I'm in now. So this document looks at your middle class and then lower class or working class as the two mains. We've heard, in America you have lower, middle, and upper class. There's a variety in between. But the education portion essentially was saying that people who come from a lower socioeconomic class or the working class believe to themselves that they aren't going to fit in or apt or are smart enough to go to these established, reputable higher education universities post high school. And it kind of never registered for me in that way because I think on my perspective, once again, I felt lucky to be empowered to do what I wanted to do and go where I wanted to go. But I could easily see how if you're born in a small rural community and, your parents wanted you to run the farm, they don't want you to or ever talk to you about going to the Harvards or the Cambridges. They talk to you about going, go to community college, go to the local state college, skip college. And that's all because that's the class you were raised in and that's the cycle that they've been raised in as well.
That's a really good point. And not only do people encourage, your surroundings encourage you to do whatever, whether it be, I think that was I was waiting for you to drop the, stay on the farm, take over the dairy product business, date your cousin. Like, I was expecting that little sly jab in there. But back to back to the kind of, being more engaged and serious about this. Not only is that, but there's a really interesting piece in this paper that I thought was something that I didn't realize to be the case until, I thought about it. And so this paper, which we will absolutely have linked in the description, it talks about how school affects how people's thoughts and ideas and behaviors are as well. So, when you think about school, you think of kind of the melting pot where it is very, you get out what you put in. If you put in a lot of effort, if you study hard, then you will excel at school for the most part. But in this paper, it actually said that school is quite built and cut out for the middle class, in the fact that a lot of middle class behaviors and ideas stem from kind of being an individual and finding like a source of creativity, almost, it sounds like, from there. So I think that being that is how these people think and feel and behave naturally, what school does, and I think to Julian's point exactly, is that it almost augments that. So it's either you excel really well because not only do you have those characteristics that help you with being kind of an individual and thinking, being a creative thinker, but then that sets you up for, oh, do I enjoy school? Do I not like school? What subjects do I like in school, and how far you're going to pursue it? So also another nudge in the direction of kind of keeping on your socioeconomic track, or you're almost like, I'm forgetting exactly what it is, but it's almost like family line working, like jobs. So in India, like people are either like someone's grandfather was a rat hunter and his great grandfather was a rat hunter before him, and so I have to be one as well. And I think it's almost like that. Obviously, way softer, and it's not. There's no bars or anything that says, you were in a lower class family, or not lower class, but working class or even below family. So that means that you have to stay that way.
Yeah. And that's something that they go into talking about, is when they give these students in a survey, they give a mixture of the class a test, and they gave them 2 colleges or universities in one survey, and then in another survey, the same students took one with a third university mentioned. 2 of those universities were being close and local, third being a little bit more reputable and higher tier. And those lower class students typically scored less on identity compatibility and lower anticipated acceptance. And to Jordan's point, it's because if all you know is how to drive a taxi or farm or work a retail store, you're not going to identify with the concepts of some of those higher education schools. But Jordan, what I do want to touch on is how you're talking about education being made for the middle class. When I read that, the way I related it was the examples that you see in school from a very young age is your typical, at least in America, middle class family, right? It's a mom and a dad, siblings, maybe multiple, maybe the grandma, grandpa, uncle, everyone's in the picture, everyone's happy, typically of a certain race. However, in a lot of lower class or working class families, you might have a split home or a single parent, or bouncing through different hardships that some of that working class and lower class never feels engaged with, because that's not how their life is going. And that goes into that bigger concept we touched on in the beginning, was of how that starts to shape you early on in classes where, yeah, you may be very, very intelligent, but if all you see is nothing you relate to, you may not push yourself to achieve those goals.
Yeah, that's a good point. I want to backtrack to something that you said initially at the very beginning of that, because I thought it was interesting that you said it this way. So you said, as far as lower class goes, they may not be fit to, I'm definitely summarizing your point. So tell me if I missed the mark, but you mentioned kind of if all they know is how to drive a taxi. I think that basically so if all they know is how to drive a taxi, then they would not be set up for the education system, because it's quite a bit different and you need different things. I think it is if all you see around you is the behavior or the specialization of doing something specific that doesn't align. So it could even be, it could be something totally different. It could just be an artist or something like that, which, I mean, granted, that's quite creative and individualistic, I believe. But it could be something totally unrelated. And I think that human beings are, we're just specialized machines. So whatever we do, even though we can do so many different things, once we are exposed to something so much, our body and our brains get used to it and almost make shortcuts in dealing with that phenomenon or experience. So I think that is also something that probably helps shape our ideas, behaviors, and feelings when it comes to, our brains and our neurons obviously fire on certain paths for certain stimulus. And if one gets nailed so many times, then it's going to be the one that, it fires quicker and easier, and that track doesn't get disrupted as much. But going forward after that, I think that when it comes to kind of tests and things of that nature, it's also kind of, it's another breeding ground for this to manifest itself, obviously, like I think you alluded to, where some people are good at taking tests, some people aren't. But not only that, but some people, self-select to be good at taking tests. And I think that self of identity also kind of pre-selects somebody from not being good at tests. So if you didn't feel like you were attached to the education system, then you necessarily wouldn't feel like you're good at taking tests, even if you were good at taking tests naturally. So I think that there's so many ramifications to this. And also I definitely wanted to touch on this point, just because I think it's so interesting, where I talked about kind of the individualistic characteristics of middle class and even upper class. But also what that means is that if you look at it the other way, so lower class, then that means that they actually were seen to be more about contextualism. And so what that means is that whatever experience happens in their life is almost like bracketed or set in the scene of this happened because of these situations. So, and granted, I'm not trying to say anything negative, but from what from my thinking, what that means is that there is a lower sense of responsibility when it comes to the things that happen in their life. And maybe that's because there is not much responsibility, or things that they have to take action in their life. I don't know. But that's what it seems like, when you're more contextual and situational about what happens in your environment, that means that you understand that you have less control, or you believe you have less control on it.
Interesting. I guess I could see that point. I read that area as something of those who are in typical lower classes are more empathetic and understanding of what's happening. I never really thought of the control aspect, as those in higher classes are more independent, and in some cases, I don't know if black and white is the right term, but to me that kind of reflects maybe those in that lower class who are more codependent is because they understand the others in their situation, as opposed to those in the, middle class it's more of, sharks battling to be the top dog, so to speak, where maybe if they're in the middle class, they're more so afraid to lose what they already have or what they've gained. So it's very rigid and strict and maybe more aggressive, and they take responsibility, as those in the lower class are more empathetic and understanding and maybe shy away from the responsibility because they understand how it impacts, them or others around them. That's just kind of how I read into it.
Yeah, that's interesting. But to be honest, I agree with your point, and I'm not sure that there's a reason why it couldn't be both. So if you think about it, if somebody didn't feel like they had much control over their environment and thought situationality was important, then I think that that would make them super sympathetic or empathetic to somebody who's going through a tough time in their life, because they totally understand what it feels like to think that the environment failed me, not necessarily I did. Or, something was out of my control in my experiences in life. So I can totally understand, and I'm empathetic to somebody else who has something happen in their life where they're out of control. So I think that maybe those things are almost complementary in themselves, and you can't really have one without the other. I mean, granted, in certain circumstances, but if you knew what it felt like to be out of control in a situation, or believed you were out of control of a situation, then you'd be even more sympathetic to somebody who was going through that same exact thing. So I think that it can't exist. They're actually dependent on each other.
And now that we kind of go into this, it's also curious to me that those at the very low end of the class spectrum that has been created, that based on what I read, is the further down you are, the more likely you are to hold extreme prejudice or racism or sexism, due to the fact that everyone around you view as a predator if they're in a similar social class. And that's why you see in a lot of instances heated tensions and debates between those who are working factory jobs, or the working class, if you go back to the 40s or the 30s, and immigrants coming in, because those immigrants who are also in working class from other areas are coming in, are going to be vying for the same position that those in the working class in America are coming for, and it becomes very aggressive. But what was very surprising is this happens at every level. If you're in the middle class, you aren't necessarily too worried about those in the lower class. But if another top dog in the middle class comes in and is vying for the same position, you may have more intense emotions or feelings or judgments towards that person, because you see them and you see similarities of yourself in there, understanding where they're trying to get and where you are.
I really thought that point was so interesting. And guys who are going to be looking into this paper, this is something that they say in the abstract themselves, like right off the gate. And I'm going to quote it verbatim because I think it's so good. So it says, from here, like we mentioned before, working class people score higher on measures of empathy and are more likely to help others in distress. We just mentioned that and why we think that is. The widely held view that working class individuals are more prejudiced towards immigrants and ethnic minorities is shown to be a function of economic threat. And so that's the point right there. But further on, this is what it says in the same sentence. And that highly educated people also express prejudice towards these groups when the latter are described as highly educated and therefore pose an economic threat. So what we're dealing with, and this isn't condoning every person who is, a fascist or a racist or, a xenophobe, but I think that people are, think about it classically. The issue that we've seen a lot, and especially with kind of 2016 elections and I think the class separation that happened there was a lot of fear of certain groups taking other people's jobs. And I think that even I will be honest, like some of that I thought, granted, yeah, like taking your jobs, like that happens, but I thought even kind of a chunk or a sizable amount of that was also kind of xenophobia. But it looks like from this survey, if we can extrapolate upon, what we see elsewhere, which I think is very fair to say, especially in the US, is that it's more just aversion to loss. And it happens in all of us, in any, class system, in any kind of situational background. Once we see that our resources are being threatened, we're going to act defensively. And I think that you perfectly portrayed it with the word prey, you said predator. So, you find that these people that are entering your workforce as predators to your resources. So well done on that point. And I thought like insanely interesting. And I mean, it makes sense, but it almost, you have to read it and take it in to like fully digest it, if that makes sense.
What were your thoughts on the economic portion of this socioeconomic classes? Because for me, I always thought socioeconomic classes were strictly defined by wealth, which is, yes, a heavy influence. However, it's not the complete influence. But what were your thoughts, Jordan, on kind of the economic breakdown, or the willingness, I should say, to donate or help others based on class?
So one thing that I want to mention before that is that I was actually shocked, or maybe I wasn't shocked, but I was surprised that there was something in this where basically they said that, your demographics. So for instance, your cultural identity. So if you wanted to be, if you believed that you were, or if you were African American, that was as important as your socioeconomic status to who you were as a person. And so I found that extremely interesting. As far as the ability to, or like kind of the, I don't know how to describe the predisposition for donations, I think basically that was interesting. I thought that it was almost like reverse of what you imagined it being. As far as, obviously the more you have, the more generous you think you'd be. But from what I read, it was actually, the more that you can relate to somebody, the more generous you could be. Is that what you picked up from that?
I did. And I thought it was, in the survey they ran 2 instances where the lower class and the middle class donated privately. And it was that the lower class was more likely to donate when it was privately, but the middle class was much more likely to donate when it was accredited back to them, which I would have thought, as Jordan kind of alluded to, I thought it might have been a little bit different because you might be a little bit more gracious with your donations. And, this is obviously based on a survey and they ran their numbers, and I'm sure, with a certain margin of error, this is true. It just was fascinating to see that what breaks down is that middle class in some cases is more frightened to lose their position or to fall classes, and are less likely to be making these donations privately unless prompted that they will be getting credit and maybe gaining some more social status or social recognition to drive them in their careers or their lives down the road.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that kind of, if you think about it, and maybe I'm like, thinking too like strategy wise or anything like that, but it's almost like in the wild where you'll see, healthy peacocks have the most colorful, male peacocks have the most colorful and large assortment of feathers. And the reason why that is because it's expensive as hell to create all that. And it's also expensive to move that around on a daily basis, and you're a lot slower. But what it does is that it differentiates male peacocks that have a lot of resources when it comes to food or good genetics to obviously clearly like female peacocks that don't have those feathers, but also not as healthy or resource rich other peacocks. And maybe I'm talking like way too meta when I'm diving into this peacock metaphor too much. But I think that what that shows is that that signaling effect that was exhibited in this study also is basically something that emulates or is emulated from nature as well. And so, for instance, the act of donating signifies that, chances are you're not from, and being recognized for it signifies, well, the reason that you donate is not only because maybe, I mean, obviously empathy, but also because it does signal your specific class in a sense as well.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to how class is kind of looked at as, you know, your relationship to production. So if you are able to donate, you know, X amount of money and get a credit to it, it's showing the levels of resources you have or you've acquired and how society has been built on these class stilts, so to speak. And it's going to continue to boost you up. And, you know, that's where some people get mad if, you know, you're online, so-and-so donates $10 million and they're a billionaire. They're like, oh, it's only $10 million. But at the end of the day, it's like, that's going to help somewhere. But it was just interesting to see that also on the lower class, the inverse, that people are still donating, but just privately. You'd figure that may be parallel, that they both would donate less privately and donate more in public because it's going to enhance that social class. But that's one of many findings throughout this white paper that surprised me.
Yeah, definitely. To mention one thing that I thought was extremely surprising, or something that kind of I really read and was like, wow, was there was also a study or like an excerpt in this where they talk about non-social behavior, or like non-verbal behavior in indications of class. And what they said was basically they observed people of lower socioeconomic status with being kind of more expressive, having more eye contact when it came to interactions, and being more likely to laugh. And then people of upper class status being kind of more disengaged socially, or, you know, less reactive when it comes to certain things. And when somebody had about a 60-second excerpt or kind of a video of who was who, they basically guessed it with a better than chance accuracy when it came to what socioeconomic static class or socioeconomic class somebody was in, which I found was extremely interesting. So, you know, basically, not only, I mean, what that means is that people on the street, before they even get to know you, and granted, maybe that this experiment I'm extrapolating too much upon as well, but it means that you show your socioeconomic status or socioeconomic class before you even say your name in some instances.
And inherently to me, I never put two and two together. And it was interesting further down where they talked about how you had an above chance accuracy of guessing someone's social class based on their Facebook photos. Or Americans in this study were able to, in just 7 words, have an above a chance of accuracy to guess social class, here again from either a nonverbal cue, a photo, or just 7 words. And that's how deep it's become ingrained into those social classes, people's personalities and way of being and way of life. And the foundation of, I mean, every single country around the world has classes, and it's through and through, and there's multiple different ways to see it outside of just how one is internally looking at social class, but how others can walk down the street and say, wow, that guy looks, you know, like he may be part of the middle class, or, you know, she maybe looks like she's at the top of the upper class, or, you know, based on this person's characteristics, they look like they are in the lower class in that prejudice, that judgment phase. It was interesting to see how, I don't know if subconscious is the right word, but just doesn't trigger for you. It just is naturally occurring.
Yeah, it's eerie, and I think that shows how deep ingrained, like we mentioned, going back to the title, that our thoughts, feelings, and behavior is. Or maybe it's something that is almost innate in all of us, where we either want to, you know, our resources. So to keep our resources or maintain them or do even better, we want to make sure that we are assimilating with the right classes. But either way, I think that this was an extremely interesting paper, and it talked about a lot of things that maybe you didn't, well, at least I didn't realize how, like, boom, they were in the moment. And so I think that, what you can learn from this is that there's a lot of things that create your identity that you may not even realize. And you may not think that shedding your situation. So maybe you were lower class and then you became upper class, but have your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors changed? I think that those are even harder to change than your economic status in some cases. And maybe that's a feedback loop. But I found this extremely, extremely interesting and something that you guys can definitely get something out of. If you took the time, sat down and read it, you'd have those moments as well.
Yeah, it's guaranteed you'll pick something up that you hadn't heard or thought of before, learn some more information on it. And it is a 25-page read. So finding the time, a couple mornings here and there, read a page or two, but it's definitely very insightful. And in many ways, depending on how you take this information, it can be motivating or inspirational to refresh your perspective on your life, or as Jordan said, your thoughts, feelings, behaviors, how you're holding yourself, how you're creating your aspirations and things of that nature to change where your destination may be subliminally heading right now, which was my biggest takeaway. And I hope you guys enjoyed it too.
Absolutely. So once again, guys, thanks for joining us on this really interesting podcast, and we will catch you next time.